In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had earned her reputation as one of the most deadly accurate snipers in her unit. Her custom Barrett M82 rifle wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of her very soul, calibrated to perfection through countless hours of training and real combat situations. But when a single bureaucratic decision stripped her of that rifle and reassigned her to standard infantry duties, nobody could have predicted that this choice would set in motion a chain of events that would push an entire squad to the very edge of survival. This is the story of how taking away one woman's specialized weapon nearly cost 12 soldiers their lives, and how sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see through a scope. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Chapman as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos ran her fingers along the familiar weight of her Barrett M82 sniper rifle for what she didn't know would be the last time in weeks. The weapon had been her constant companion through 18 months of deployment in Afghanistan's Kunar province, and together they had saved more lives than she cared to count. Each scratch on the stock told a story. Each adjustment to the scope represented hours of meticulous calibration under the harsh mountain conditions. Maria had joined the army 5 years earlier, straight out of a small farming town in Texas, where her grandfather had taught her to shoot prairie dogs at impossible distances with an old hunting rifle. What started as weekend entertainment had evolved into something much more significant when her drill sergeants noticed her natural ability during basic training. By the time she completed sniper school at Fort Benning, instructors were calling her one of the most naturally gifted marksmen they had ever trained. Her current unit, Bravo Company of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, operated in some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. The Kunar province was a maze of valleys and ridgelines, where Taliban fighters could disappear like ghosts, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to launch devastating ambushes before melting away into the mountains. In this environment, having a skilled sniper who could reach out and touch targets at extreme range was not just an advantage, it was often the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic loss of life. The relationship between Maria and her rifle went far beyond the typical soldier-weapon bond. The Barrett M82 was a 50 caliber anti-material rifle, originally designed to disable vehicles and equipment at long range, but in the hands of an expert marksman, it could neutralize human targets at distances exceeding a mile. Maria had spent countless hours learning every nuance of the weapon, understanding how altitude, temperature, humidity, and wind speed would affect her shots in the thin mountain air of Afghanistan. Her spotter, Corporal Jake Thompson, had been with her for 8 months, and their partnership had become legendary within the company. Jake was a former mathematics student from Ohio who could calculate firing solutions in his head faster than most people could work them out on paper. Together, they had developed an almost telepathic communication system, able to coordinate complex shots with minimal verbal exchange. The morning routine was always the same. Maria would arrive at the armory before dawn, carefully inspecting every component of her rifle system. She would check the scope mounts, verify the zero, and examine each piece of equipment that might affect her accuracy. The process took nearly an hour, but it was time well spent. In her line of work, there were no second chances to get it right. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. There was an unusual amount of activity around the command post, with officers coming and going more frequently than normal. Maria noticed several vehicles that didn't belong to their unit parked near the headquarters building, including what appeared to be staff cars from higher headquarters. In the military, unexpected visits from senior officers rarely brought good news for the soldiers on the ground. As Maria completed her equipment check, First Sergeant Rodriguez approached her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had served multiple deployments in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and Maria had never seen him look uncertain about anything. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had seen every possible situation the military could throw at him, but today there was something different in his demeanor. "Santos, I need you to come with me to the command post," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "Bring your rifle." The walk across the small forward operating base took less than 5 minutes, but Maria felt a growing sense of unease with each step. Other soldiers they passed gave her curious looks, and she noticed several of her squad mates gathered in small groups, engaged in hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. Whatever was happening, it was clear that word was already beginning to spread throughout the unit. The command post was a reinforced building constructed from concrete barriers and steel plates, designed to withstand mortar and rocket attacks that were a regular occurrence at their location. Inside, the walls were covered with maps, communication equipment, and the various charts and boards that tracked the unit's operations throughout their area of responsibility. Maria had been inside many times for mission briefings, but today the atmosphere felt charged with tension. Captain Williams, that company commander, was seated behind a folding table with several officers Maria didn't recognize. Their uniforms bore the insignia of higher headquarters units, and their clean appearance and perfect military bearing marked them clearly as staff officers who spent their time in air-conditioned offices rather than dusty mountain outposts. Maria immediately felt a surge of resentment toward these rear-echelon personnel who would make decisions affecting soldiers in combat without truly understanding the realities of life on the front lines. "Staff Sergeant Santos, please have a seat," Captain Williams said, gesturing toward a metal folding chair positioned in front of the table. His tone was formal and official, completely different from the casual manner he normally used when speaking with his soldiers. Maria placed her rifle carefully against the wall and sat down, her mind racing through possible explanations for this unusual gathering. The senior officer, a lieutenant colonel whose name tape read Morrison, opened a manila folder and began reading from an official document. "Staff Sergeant Santos, it has come to our attention that there are concerns regarding the employment of anti-material rifles in your current operational environment. Recent incidents involving civilian casualties in other areas of operation have prompted a review of current policies regarding the use of 50 caliber weapon systems." Maria felt her stomach drop as she began to understand where this conversation was heading. She had heard rumors about policy changes being considered at higher levels of command, but she had never imagined they would affect her unit directly. The idea that her rifle, the tool that had saved so many lives, might be taken away seemed impossible to comprehend. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison continued reading from his prepared statement, his voice maintaining the bureaucratic monotone that seemed to be a requirement for delivering unwelcome news. "Effective immediately. All Barrett M82 rifle systems will be withdrawn from forward-deployed units pending completion of this review. Soldiers currently assigned as designated marksmen will be reassigned to standard infantry roles within their respective units." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She looked toward Captain Williams, hoping to see some indication that he would fight this decision, but his expression remained carefully neutral. As a company commander, he was caught between his obligation to support his soldiers and his responsibility to implement orders from higher headquarters, regardless of his personal opinions about their wisdom. "Sir, with all due respect," Maria began, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotions churning inside her. "My rifle has been directly responsible for saving American lives on numerous occasions. Just last month, I was able to neutralize 3 enemy fighters who were preparing to ambush one of our patrols. Without the range and accuracy of the 50 caliber system, those soldiers would have walked into a deadly trap." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison looked up from his documents with an expression of mild annoyance, as if Maria had interrupted an important business meeting rather than challenged a decision that could affect the safety of her fellow soldiers. "Staff Sergeant, I understand your concerns, but this decision has been made at levels far above this unit. Policy changes of this nature are implemented for the greater good of all coalition forces operating in this theater." Maria felt her anger beginning to build, but years of military discipline kept her response measured and professional. "Sir, may I ask what specific incidents prompted this policy change?" "In 18 months of operations, my unit has had 0 civilian casualties attributable to sniper operations. Our rules of engagement are strictly followed, and every shot is carefully considered and documented." The question seemed to catch the lieutenant colonel off guard, and he shuffled through his papers for several seconds before responding. "The specific details of those incidents are not relevant to this discussion. What matters is that a comprehensive review of these weapon systems has been ordered, and all units will comply with the temporary withdrawal directive." Captain Williams finally spoke up, his voice carrying a note of frustration that he was trying hard to suppress. "Colonel, Staff Sergeant Santos is one of our most valuable assets in this operational environment. Her skills have been instrumental in the success of numerous missions, and removing her specialized capability will significantly impact our unit's effectiveness." "Captain, I understand your position, but this decision is not open for debate," Morrison replied curtly. "The weapons will be collected and transported to rear area facilities within 48 hours. Personnel affected by this directive will be reassigned to duties more appropriate to their rank and experience level." Maria realized that no amount of rational argument would change the outcome of this meeting. The decision had been made by people who would never have to live with its consequences, implemented by officers whose primary concern was career advancement rather than soldier welfare. She had seen this pattern before during her years of service, but never in a situation where the stakes were so clearly a matter of life and death. "What will be my new assignment, sir?" Maria asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison consulted another document before responding. "You will be assigned as a team leader in 2nd Platoon, with standard M4 carbine and equipment load. Your experience and leadership skills will be valuable in that role." The irony was not lost on Maria. After years of specialized training and proven performance in one of the military's most demanding fields, she was being reassigned to carry a weapon that any private could master in a matter of weeks. The M4 carbine was an excellent rifle for close-range engagements, but its effective range was measured in hundreds of yards rather than the mile-plus distances she was accustomed to covering with her Barrett. As the meeting concluded, and the officers began gathering their paperwork, Maria felt a sense of profound loss that went beyond simple disappointment. Her rifle represented years of dedicated training, countless hours of practice, and a level of expertise that had taken most of her adult life to develop. More importantly, it represented her ability to protect her fellow soldiers in ways that no other weapon system could match. The next 2 days passed in a blur of administrative procedures and equipment transfers. Maria watched as her carefully maintained rifle was packed into a shipping container, along with her specialized optics, range-finding equipment, and the custom ammunition she had hand-selected for maximum accuracy. Each item represented a piece of her professional identity being systematically dismantled by bureaucratic indifference. Her new equipment issue was completed with typical military efficiency. The M4 carbine she received was well-maintained but utterly generic, identical to thousands of others throughout the Army. The scope mounted on top was adequate for standard infantry operations, but laughably inadequate compared to the precision optics she had been using. Her load-bearing equipment was reconfigured to carry standard infantry supplies rather than the specialized gear of a designated marksman. Corporal Thompson took the change particularly hard. As her spotter, his role had been eliminated entirely, and he was reassigned to drive one of the unit's mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. The partnership they had built over months of combat operations was dissolved with the stroke of a pen, replaced by new assignments that would separate them indefinitely. "This is insane, Sergeant," Thompson said as they conducted their final equipment inventory together. "Command is taking away our most effective long-range capability right when we need it most. Intelligence reports have been indicating increased enemy activity throughout our area of operations, and now they want to fight that threat with fewer tools than we had before." Maria nodded grimly as she signed the final paperwork, transferring custody of her rifle system. "Jake, you know as well as I do that decisions like this get made by people who will never have to live with the consequences. Our job is to adapt and find ways to keep our soldiers alive, regardless of what tools they give us to work with." But even as she spoke those words, Maria felt a deep sense of foreboding about what lay ahead. The mountains of Afghanistan were unforgiving enough when soldiers had every available advantage at their disposal. Removing a key capability like precision long-range fire support seemed like an invitation for disaster. The impact of the policy change became apparent almost immediately. Within days of Maria's reassignment, the unit began receiving intelligence reports of increased enemy movement in areas that had previously been kept clear by the threat of long-range sniper fire. Taliban fighters, apparently aware that American units had lost their overwatch capability, began moving with greater boldness and frequency. 2nd Platoon, Maria's new assignment, was scheduled for a patrol operation into one of the most contested valleys in their area of responsibility. The mission was straightforward in concept but dangerous in execution. Establish observation posts on key terrain features and provide early warning of enemy movement toward the main supply route that connected their forward operating base with larger installations to the south. Lieutenant Hayes, the platoon leader, was a recent graduate of the Infantry Officer Basic Course with less than 2 months of combat experience. He was eager to prove himself in combat but lacked the seasoned judgment that comes only through extended exposure to the complexities of counterinsurgency warfare. During the mission briefing, he outlined an aggressive patrol route that would take the platoon deep into territory where enemy contact was considered highly likely. "Our intelligence indicates that enemy forces have been using this valley as a transit route for moving supplies and personnel," Lieutenant Hayes explained, pointing to locations on a large-scale map of their operational area. "By establishing observation posts on these ridgelines, we can monitor enemy movement and call in airstrikes or artillery as targets of opportunity present themselves." Maria studied the proposed route with growing concern. Terrain was extremely challenging, with steep ridgelines and narrow valleys that would canalize the platoon's movement and provide numerous opportunities for ambush. More troubling was the distance from supporting units and the limited options for evacuation if things went wrong. "Sir, what assets do we have for overwatch and fire support?" Maria asked, though she already suspected the answer would be disappointing. We'll have a section of mortars on call from the fire base, and close air support should be available if we run into serious trouble, Hayes replied. The route has been cleared by higher headquarters, and they don't anticipate any significant enemy resistance. Maria exchanged glances with some of the more experienced soldiers in the platoon. The phrase, "don't anticipate significant enemy resistance," had become something of a dark joke among combat veterans, as it seemed to guarantee exactly the opposite outcome. In Maria's experience, enemy fighters were most dangerous precisely when American commanders didn't expect them to be present. As the platoon prepared for the mission, Maria found herself thinking constantly about the Barrett rifle that was now sitting in some rear area warehouse. The terrain they would be operating in was ideal for long-range precision fire, with clear sightlines extending for thousands of yards across the valley floors. A skilled sniper positioned on the high ground could provide effective overwatch for the entire patrol route, eliminating threats before they could close to effective range of standard infantry weapons. Without that capability, the platoon would be operating essentially blind, relying on luck and the reflexes of individual soldiers to survive contact with an enemy that knew the terrain intimately and could choose the time and place of any engagement. It was a tactical disadvantage that could prove fatal if the intelligence estimates about enemy activity turned out to be incorrect. The night before the patrol, Maria lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, and thinking about all the ways the mission could go wrong. In her years as a sniper, she had developed an appreciation for the importance of detailed planning and careful preparation. Every shot she took was the result of extensive observation, precise calculation, and methodical execution. The idea of walking into enemy territory without that level of preparation felt fundamentally wrong to her professional instincts. But orders were orders, and Maria had never been one to shirk her responsibilities regardless of her personal opinions about their wisdom. She checked her equipment one final time, ensuring that her M4 carbine was clean and properly zeroed, her ammunition was properly distributed, and her gear was configured for maximum efficiency during what promised to be a grueling foot patrol through some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. As dawn broke over the mountains surrounding Forward Operating Base Chapman, Maria joined the rest of 2nd Platoon for final preparations and last-minute intelligence updates. The mission would take them approximately 8 miles from their starting point, following a route that would gain nearly 3,000 feet in elevation as they moved toward their assigned observation positions. Standing in formation with her new unit, Maria felt the weight of responsibility that came with her role as a team leader. The soldiers under her command were competent and well-trained, but they lacked the combat experience that might make the difference between success and disaster in a complex tactical situation. Their survival might depend on decisions she would have to make in split seconds under the most stressful conditions imaginable. As the patrol moved out through the main gate of the firebase, Maria took one last look back at the familiar buildings and defensive positions that had been home for the past year and a half. Something deep in her gut told her that this mission would be different from anything she had experienced before, and not in a good way. The absence of her Barrett rifle felt like a phantom limb, a missing piece of herself that could prove crucial when the shooting started. The first few hours of the patrol proceeded without incident. The platoon moved carefully along a route that had been traveled many times before, following established procedures for movement through potentially hostile territory. Point men rotated every hour to maintain alertness, radio checks were conducted at regular intervals, and security halts were implemented whenever the tactical situation required careful observation of the surrounding terrain. But Maria could feel the difference that the loss of overwatch capability made to the unit's tactical situation. Without a sniper providing long-range observation and fire support, the platoon was essentially operating in a bubble of awareness that extended only as far as individual soldiers could see with their naked eyes or basic optical equipment. In terrain where enemy fighters could observe them from distances measured in miles, this limitation represented a potentially fatal disadvantage. As the patrol climbed higher into the mountains, the terrain became increasingly challenging, and the potential for enemy contact grew correspondingly greater. Maria found herself constantly scanning the ridgelines above their route of march, knowing that somewhere in those rocks and shadows, enemy fighters might be tracking their movement and preparing an ambush that could devastate the platoon before they even knew they were under attack. The loss of her precision rifle had created a tactical vacuum that no amount of standard infantry equipment could fill, and with each step deeper into enemy territory, Maria became more convinced that this vacuum would soon be filled with the blood of American soldiers. The patrol had been moving for 6 hours when everything changed in the space of a heartbeat. Maria was positioned near the middle of the formation, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead and to the flanks, when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. High on a ridgeline, Approximately 1,500 yards to their north, she caught a brief glint of reflected sunlight off what appeared to be metal or glass. In her previous role as a sniper, she would have immediately recognized this as the telltale signature of an optical device, either binoculars or a rifle scope, and would have been able to engage the threat with her Barrett rifle before it could pose any danger to the patrol. Now, armed only with her M4 carbine with an effective range of roughly 400 yards, she could do nothing but watch and report the potential threat to Lieutenant Hayes. The young officer listened to her assessment with apparent concern, but seemed uncertain about how to proceed. Without the ability to definitively identify the source of the reflection or engage it if it proved hostile, the patrol was left with limited options, none of them particularly appealing. Could be enemy observation, could be nothing. Hayes said after considering Maria's report, "We'll make note of it in our situation report, but we need to continue with the mission as planned." Maria felt a familiar frustration building inside her chest. In her role as a sniper, she would have been able to provide definitive intelligence about the nature of the threat, either confirming it as enemy activity or ruling it out as a false alarm. More importantly, if enemy fighters were indeed observing the patrol from that position, she would have been able to eliminate them before they could report the American unit's location and movement to their commanders. The patrol continued climbing toward their assigned observation positions, but Maria noticed subtle changes in the behavior of her soldiers that indicated they were beginning to sense something was wrong. Experienced infantry soldiers develop an almost supernatural ability to detect danger, a combination of conscious observation and subconscious processing that alerts them to threats before their rational minds can fully analyze the situation. Several of her team members were displaying the telltale signs of heightened alertness that usually preceded contact with enemy forces. Private First Class Martinez, one of the younger soldiers in Maria's team, approached her during a brief halt to adjust equipment loads. "Sergeant, something doesn't feel right about this area. I keep getting the feeling like we're being watched, but I can't put my finger on anything specific." Maria nodded grimly. Martinez was relatively new to combat operations, but he had good instincts, and his concerns mirrored her own growing unease about their tactical situation. "Stay alert and keep your spacing," she told him. "Trust your gut feelings out here. They'll keep you alive longer than any manual or training program." As the patrol approached the first of their assigned observation positions, the terrain became increasingly treacherous. The trail they were following had been carved into the side of a steep slope, with a nearly vertical drop-off to one side and an equally steep rise on the other. It was exactly the kind of terrain that favored defending forces over attacking ones, providing numerous positions from which enemy fighters could observe American movements while remaining effectively invisible themselves. Lieutenant Hayes called a halt approximately 200 yards short of the observation post to conduct a final reconnaissance of the area before committing the entire patrol to what could potentially be a trap. Maria was selected to lead a small advance team to clear the position and ensure it was suitable for occupation by the larger unit. As she moved forward with 3 other soldiers, she felt acutely aware of how exposed they were to potential enemy fire from the surrounding high ground. The observation post itself was located on a rocky outcropping that provided excellent visibility over the valley below, but virtually no protection from enemy fire originating from higher elevations. As Maria surveyed the position, she realized that whoever had selected this location had prioritized observation capability over defensive considerations. While the post would indeed provide good intelligence about enemy movement in the valley, it would also serve as an excellent target for any enemy forces positioned on the numerous ridgelines that surrounded it. "This position is completely exposed to fire from at least 6 different directions," Maria reported to Lieutenant Hayes over her radio. "If we occupied this location, we need to be prepared for the possibility that enemy forces could engage us from multiple positions simultaneously." Hayes acknowledged her report but indicated that higher headquarters had specifically designated this location as a priority observation post, and the patrol would proceed with its occupation as planned. Maria felt another surge of frustration at the inflexibility of military planning that seemed to ignore tactical realities in favor of predetermined objectives that looked good on maps but made little sense on the ground. As the full patrol moved into position at the observation post, Maria found herself constantly scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of enemy activity. Her experience as a sniper had taught her to think like her adversaries, to identify the positions she would choose if she were planning an ambush against American forces. From that perspective, their current location was a tactical nightmare, offering enemies multiple advantageous firing positions while providing the American patrol with virtually no covered routes of withdrawal. The first indication that her concerns were justified came approximately 30 minutes after the patrol had settled into their observation positions. Specialist Johnson, who was manning one of the squad's radio systems, reported that he was having difficulty maintaining communication with their supporting fire base. Radio communication in mountainous terrain was always challenging, but the timing of the communication difficulties seemed suspicious to Maria. "Sergeant, I'm getting a lot of static on the battalion frequency, and I can't seem to reach the fire direction center for the mortars," Johnson reported. "It's like something is interfering with our signals." Maria's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. Enemy forces in Afghanistan had become increasingly sophisticated in their use of electronic warfare techniques, including the use of jammers to disrupt American communications at critical moments during engagements. If their communications were being deliberately degraded, it meant that enemy forces were not only aware of their location, but were actively preparing to attack them. She immediately moved to Lieutenant Hayes' position to report her suspicions, but before she could reach him, the world exploded into chaos. The first enemy shots came from a position approximately 800 yards to the northeast, well beyond the effective range of the patrol's M4 carbines, but easily within range of the enemy's weapon systems. The distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds passing overhead was immediately followed by the deeper boom of the weapons that had fired them. "Contact northeast, 800 yards," Maria shouted, as she dove for whatever cover the rocky terrain could provide. Around her, the other members of the patrol were scrambling for defensive positions as more enemy fire began impacting around their location from multiple directions. Lieutenant Hayes was shouting orders into his radio, attempting to coordinate the patrol's response to the ambush while simultaneously trying to call for supporting fire from the mortars at their firebase. But the communication difficulties Johnson had reported were now becoming critical, as static and interference made it nearly impossible to transmit clear messages to higher headquarters. Maria found herself in the bitter irony of a situation she had warned about, but been powerless to prevent. With her Barrett rifle, she could have engaged enemy positions at the ranges from which they were currently receiving fire. She could have systematically eliminated enemy fighters one by one, using her superior optics and precision fire capability to turn the tactical situation in favor of the American patrol. Instead, she was armed with a weapon that was virtually useless at the ranges involved in this engagement. "We need to move to better positions," she shouted to the soldiers in her immediate vicinity. "This location is a death trap." But even as she said the words, Maria realized that movement under fire would be extremely dangerous, without some form of covering fire to suppress enemy positions. The patrol was effectively pinned down by enemy fire from multiple directions, unable to move without exposing themselves to devastating accurate fire from positions they could barely see, much less engage effectively. The situation deteriorated rapidly as more enemy fighters joined the engagement from additional positions around the observation post. What had begun as harassing fire from a single location quickly escalated into a coordinated attack involving at least a dozen enemy fighters positioned on multiple ridgelines. The volume and accuracy of enemy fire made it clear that this was not a chance encounter, but a carefully planned ambush designed to exploit the tactical limitations of American infantry forces. Private First Class Rodriguez, one of the soldiers in Maria's team, was struck by enemy fire while attempting to move to a better defensive position. The impact of the round spun him around and dropped him behind a cluster of rocks approximately 20 yards from Maria's position. His screams of pain and calls for help were clearly audible over the sound of continuing enemy fire, but reaching him would require crossing open ground under direct observation by multiple enemy positions. "Medic," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the particular note of panic that indicated a serious wound. "I'm hit. I need help." Maria assessed the tactical situation with the cold calculation that had made her an effective sniper. Reaching Rodriguez would require exposing herself to enemy fire from at least 3 different directions. And without the ability to suppress those positions, any rescue attempt would likely result in additional casualties. But leaving the wounded soldier exposed to continued enemy fire was unthinkable from both a tactical and moral standpoint. She made her decision with the same decisive speed that had characterized her best sniper shots. "Johnson, Martinez, provide covering fire on my command," she shouted to the closest members of her team. "I'm going after Rodriguez." The 2 soldiers acknowledged her order and prepared to engage the enemy positions with their M4 carbines, though Maria knew their fire would be largely ineffective at the ranges involved. Still, the sound and fury of their shots might cause enemy fighters to temporarily take cover, providing her with a brief window of opportunity to reach the wounded soldier. "Now!" Maria shouted as she broke cover and began sprinting toward Rodriguez's position. Behind her, Johnson and Martinez opened fire on the enemy positions, their weapons chattering in rapid succession as they attempted to provide the covering fire she had requested. The 20-yard dash felt like an eternity as Maria bounded over the rocky terrain while enemy rounds cracked past her head and sparked off the stones around her feet. She could hear the distinctive whine of near misses and feel the pressure waves of rounds passing close enough to part her hair. But her years of combat experience had taught her to compartmentalize fear and focus on the immediate tactical requirements of the situation. She reached Rodriguez's position just as a burst of enemy fire shattered the rocks directly above their location, showering both soldiers with fragments of stone and dust. Rodriguez had been hit in the upper leg by what appeared to be a rifle round, and blood was seeping through his uniform at an alarming rate. Maria immediately applied pressure to the wound while assessing his overall condition. "How bad is it, Sergeant?" Rodriguez asked through gritted teeth, his face pale from blood loss and shock. "You'll be fine," Maria lied smoothly, while examining the wound more closely. The round had struck him in the thigh but appeared to have missed the major arteries, though he was losing blood at a rate that would become critical if not addressed soon. "We just need to get you back to better cover and get some proper medical attention." But even as she spoke, Maria realized that moving Rodriguez to safety would be even more challenging than reaching him had been. The young soldier would be unable to move quickly on his own, meaning she would have to either carry him or assist him while both were exposed to enemy fire. Neither option offered particularly good prospects for success. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate as enemy fighters adjusted their positions to bring more effective fire to bear on the pinned American patrol. Maria could hear Lieutenant Hayes shouting increasingly desperate orders into his radio, trying to coordinate defensive fires and call for reinforcements, but the communication difficulties were preventing him from making contact with supporting units. Specialist Johnson managed to reach Maria's position during a brief lull in enemy fire, carrying additional ammunition and the patrol's medical kit. "Sergeant, the LT says we need to find a way to break contact and move to a better defensive position," he reported breathlessly. "But every route out of here is under direct enemy observation." Maria nodded grimly as she worked to stabilize Rodriguez's wound using supplies from the medical kit. The patrol was caught in a classic tactical dilemma. They needed to move to survive, but movement under current conditions would likely result in additional casualties. Without some form of fire support to suppress enemy positions, they were effectively trapped in a killing zone of the enemy's choosing. "What about close air support?" Maria asked, knowing that attack helicopters or fixed-wing aircraft might be able to engage enemy positions that were beyond the range of the patrol's organic weapons. "LT's been trying to call it in, but the communications problems are making it impossible to get clear coordinates to the pilots," Johnson replied. "Even if aircraft are available, they can't engage targets they can't identify." The bitter irony of the situation was not lost on Maria. With her Barrett rifle and precision optics, she would have been able to provide detailed target information to supporting aircraft, using her scope to identify enemy positions and guide airstrikes with deadly accuracy. Instead, the patrol was limited to vague descriptions of enemy locations that were insufficient for close air support operations in terrain where friendly and enemy forces might be separated by only a few hundred yards. As if to emphasize their predicament, another burst of enemy fire impacted near their position, sending rock fragments flying in all directions. One of the fragments struck Johnson in the face, opening a gash across his cheek that immediately began bleeding profusely. Though not life-threatening, the wound was a stark reminder of how exposed they remained to enemy fire. "We can't stay here much longer," Johnson said, wiping blood from his face with the back of his hand. "They're getting our range figured out, and sooner or later they're going to get lucky with one of these shots." Maria knew he was right, but she also knew that any attempt to move under current conditions would be extremely hazardous. The patrol needed some form of advantage to shift the tactical balance in their favor. But with their most effective long-range weapons sitting in a warehouse hundreds of miles away, their options were severely limited. It was at that moment that Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. If the bureaucrats had taken away her precision rifle, she would have to create her own version of precision fire using the tools available to her. She began mentally calculating distances to the various enemy positions, accounting for the ballistic characteristics of her M4 carbine and the environmental conditions that would affect her shots. "Johnson, I need you to spot for me like we used to do with the Barrett," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her an effective sniper. "I'm going to try to engage these positions one at a time using aimed semi-automatic fire." Johnson looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Sergeant, the M4 isn't designed for precision work at these ranges. Even with perfect shooting, the ballistics just aren't there for consistent hits beyond about 400 yards. "Maybe not," Maria replied as she adjusted her rifle's optic and selected her ammunition carefully. "But sometimes you have to work with what you have instead of what you wish you had." She settled into a stable firing position and began the methodical process of range estimation, and target acquisition that had become second nature during her years as a designated marksman. The enemy positions were indeed beyond the optimal range for her current weapon, but they weren't impossible targets for a skilled shooter who understood the principles of long-range marksmanship. The first shot was more of an experiment than a serious attempt to hit a specific target. Maria aimed at an enemy position approximately 600 yards away and fired a single, carefully aimed round, watching through her scope to observe where the bullet impacted. The shot struck low and to the left of her point of aim, giving her valuable information about how to adjust her subsequent shots. She made the necessary corrections and fired again, this time seeing her bullet strike much closer to the intended target. While she couldn't be certain of hitting individual enemy fighters at these ranges with an M4 carbine, she could certainly make their positions uncomfortable enough to disrupt their ability to deliver accurate fire on the American patrol. Over the next few minutes, Maria systematically engaged each enemy position she could identify, firing carefully aimed shots designed to force enemy fighters to take cover rather than necessarily eliminate them. The psychological effect of receiving accurate return fire was often as valuable as the physical effects of actual casualties, and she could see that her efforts were beginning to have an impact on the enemy's behavior. "It's working," Johnson reported, as he observed the results of Maria's fire through his binoculars. "They're not firing as much, and when they do, it's less accurate. I think you've got them rattled." But Maria knew that her improvised solution was only a temporary expedient. She was expending ammunition at a rate that couldn't be sustained indefinitely, and sooner or later the enemy fighters would adapt to her tactics and resume their effective fire on the patrol's positions. What the patrol really needed was a fundamental change in their tactical situation, either through the arrival of reinforcements or the successful coordination of supporting fires. Lieutenant Hayes managed to reach their position during another brief lull in enemy fire, carrying his radio and looking considerably more haggard than he had at the beginning of the patrol. "Santos, I need your assessment of our situation," he said without preamble. "Haya is asking for recommendations on how to proceed." Maria took a moment to consider their tactical position before responding. "Sir, we're pinned down by approximately 12 to 15 enemy fighters positioned on multiple ridgelines. Our organic weapons are marginally effective against these positions due to range limitations. We have one serious casualty who needs immediate medical evacuation, and our communication difficulties are preventing effective coordination with supporting assets." Hayes nodded grimly as he processed this information. "What do you recommend?" "We need to create a diversion that will allow us to move to better defensive positions," Maria replied. "If we can get air support to engage even one of these enemy positions, it might cause the others to withdraw, or at least shift their attention long enough for us to displace. I've been trying to get close air support for the past hour, but the pilots can't identify specific targets from their altitude," Hayes said with obvious frustration. "They need more precise target information than I can provide with current communications equipment." Maria felt a surge of the same frustration that had been building since her rifle had been taken away. With her Barrett rifle and high-quality optics, she would have been able to provide pilots with precise target coordinates and even designate specific enemy positions using tracers or signal devices. Instead, the patrol was reduced to vague descriptions that were insufficient for close air support operations in complex terrain. The sound of additional enemy fire from a new direction indicated that their tactical situation was about to become even more challenging. Enemy reinforcements were apparently arriving on scene, and the volume of fire directed at the patrol's position was increasing correspondingly. What had begun as a manageable engagement was rapidly escalating into a desperate fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Rodriguez's condition was also beginning to deteriorate as blood loss and shock took their toll. Despite Maria's first aid efforts, he needed proper medical attention soon, or his wound could become life-threatening. The patrol was facing the possibility of multiple casualties if they couldn't find a way to break contact with enemy forces and withdraw to a more defensible position. As enemy fire intensified around their position, Maria realized that desperate situations called for desperate measures. If conventional tactics weren't sufficient to extract the patrol from their predicament, she would have to rely on unconventional approaches that might provide the edge they needed to survive the next few hours. The intensity of enemy fire reached a crescendo that made communication between patrol members nearly impossible without shouting. Maria could hear the distinctive whistling of mortar rounds in the distance, indicating that enemy forces were preparing to bring indirect fire to bear on their position. If enemy mortars began impacting around the observation post, the patrol's already precarious situation would become absolutely untenable. "Incoming mortars!" she shouted to everyone within earshot, though there was little the soldiers could do except press themselves closer to whatever cover the rocky terrain provided. The first mortar round impacted approximately 50 yards from their position, sending rock fragments and debris flying through the air with deadly force. The explosion was followed by 2 more rounds that warped progressively closer to the patrol's defensive positions, indicating that enemy mortar crews were conducting a deliberate fire mission designed to bracket their target and achieve maximum effectiveness. Lieutenant Hayes was frantically working his radio, trying to coordinate counter-battery fire from their own mortars back at the firebase, but the communication difficulties that had plagued the patrol since the beginning of the engagement continued to prevent effective coordination with supporting units. Static and interference made it nearly impossible to transmit clear-fire missions or coordinate complex tactical maneuvers. Maria realized that waiting for help from higher headquarters was rapidly becoming a luxury the patrol couldn't afford. With enemy reinforcements arriving and indirect fire beginning to impact near their position, they had perhaps minutes rather than hours before their situation became completely hopeless. She made a decision that would either save the patrol or get them all killed in the attempt. "Johnson, Martinez, listen up," she called to the soldiers nearest her position. "We're going to conduct a fighting withdrawal to that ridgeline about 300 yards to the south. I'll provide covering fire while you move Rodriguez to the alternate position." Both soldiers looked at her with expressions that indicated they understood the enormous risks involved in attempting to move under the current conditions. Enemy fire was coming from multiple directions, and any movement would expose them to devastating accurate fire from positions they could barely see, much less effectively engage. "Sergeant, that's a long way to move a wounded man under fire," Johnson pointed out, though his tone indicated that he was ready to attempt the maneuver if she ordered it. "It's either that or we all die here," Maria replied bluntly. "The mortars are getting closer, and once they get our position bracketed, this entire area becomes a kill zone." She began preparing for what she knew would be the most challenging shooting of her career. Without her Barrett rifle, she would have to provide effective covering fire using an M4 carbine against targets at ranges where the weapon's effectiveness was marginal at best. But years of training and combat experience had taught her that impossible situations sometimes required impossible solutions. Maria positioned herself in the most advantageous location she could find, a small depression in the rocks that provided some protection from enemy fire, while still allowing her to observe and engage the various enemy positions. She methodically arranged her ammunition for maximum efficiency, counting her remaining rounds and calculating how many shots she could afford to fire at each target. "On my signal, you move," she told Johnson and Martinez. "I'll engage the enemy positions from north to east in sequence, trying to force them to take cover while you get Rodriguez to safety." The young soldiers nodded their understanding, though she could see the fear in their eyes. They were about to attempt a maneuver that would have been challenging even under ideal conditions, and current conditions were anything but ideal. Success would require precise timing, steady nerves, and more than a little luck. Maria settled into her firing position and began the familiar routine of target acquisition and range estimation that had become instinctive during her years as a designated marksman. The enemy positions were clearly visible through her rifle's optic, but engaging them effectively with her current weapon would require every bit of skill and experience she had accumulated over her military career. "Ready?" she asked Johnson and Martinez, who had positioned themselves to lift Rodriguez and carry him to the alternate position. "Ready, Sergeant," both men replied simultaneously. "Move." Maria opened fire on the northernmost enemy position, sending a rapid series of carefully aimed shots toward the rocky outcropping, where she had observed muzzle flashes from enemy weapons. While she couldn't be certain of hitting specific individuals, the accuracy of her fire was sufficient to force enemy fighters to take cover, rather than continue engaging the moving American soldiers. She immediately shifted her fire to the next enemy position, maintaining a steady rate of accurate shots that kept enemy heads down while Johnson and Martinez began their desperate dash across open ground with the wounded Rodriguez between them. The three soldiers moved as quickly as the terrain and Rodriguez's condition would allow, bounding from one piece of cover to the next while enemy rounds cracked past their heads. Maria continued engaging enemy positions in sequence, systematically working her way around the perimeter and forcing each group of fighters to seek cover just long enough for her comrades to cross the most dangerous portions of open ground. It was a delicate balance between providing effective suppression and conserving ammunition for the challenges that would certainly follow. The maneuver was halfway complete when disaster struck. A burst of enemy fire from a position Maria hadn't identified caught Martinez in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to lose his grip on Rodriguez. The wounded soldier fell heavily to the ground, crying out in pain as his injured leg struck a jagged rock. "Martinez is hit," Johnson shouted, though he continued moving toward the alternate position while dragging Rodriguez as best he could manage alone. Maria shifted her fire toward the position that had wounded Martinez, sending a concentrated burst of rounds that forced the enemy fighters to take cover. But she realized that the tactical situation had just become significantly more complex. Now she had 2 wounded soldiers who needed assistance, and Johnson couldn't move both of them to safety without help. Without hesitation, Maria left her firing position and sprinted across the open ground toward her fallen comrades. Enemy rounds cracked past her as she ran, and she could hear the distinctive snap of near misses passing close enough to feel the pressure waves. But her focus was entirely on reaching her soldiers and getting them to safety. She reached Martinez's position just as enemy fire intensified from multiple directions, indicating that the fighters had recognized her movement and were attempting to prevent her from reaching her wounded soldiers. Martinez had been struck in the shoulder, but was still conscious and able to move, though his left arm was essentially useless. "Can you walk?" Maria asked as she helped Martinez to his feet. "I think so," Martinez replied through gritted teeth, though his pale complexion and unsteady movement indicated that he was in considerable pain. Together, they managed to reach Johnson's position where Rodriguez was still losing blood from his original wound. The 3 unwounded soldiers now faced the challenge of moving 2 casualties across several hundred yards of open ground while under fire from multiple enemy positions. It was a tactical problem that had no good solutions, only degrees of risk and potential catastrophe. "We'll have to move them one at a time," Maria decided. "Johnson, you take Rodriguez first. Martinez and I will provide covering fire from here until you reach the alternate position. Then I'll bring Martinez across." It was a plan born of desperation rather than tactical wisdom, but given their limited options and deteriorating situation, it represented their best hope for extracting the casualties without additional losses. Johnson nodded his understanding and prepared to lift Rodriguez for the dangerous journey across enemy-controlled terrain. The next few minutes passed in a blur of gunfire, movement, and controlled chaos. Maria and Martinez engaged enemy positions with their rifles while Johnson carried Rodriguez toward the alternate position, moving in short bounds between available cover, while enemy fire kicked up dust and rock fragments around their feet. Twice during the movement, Maria was certain that enemy rounds had found their target, but somehow Johnson managed to reach safety with Rodriguez still alive. "Your turn," Maria told Martinez, as she helped him prepare for his own movement to the alternate position. The young soldier's wound was bleeding steadily, and his face was growing increasingly pale from blood loss and shock. "I don't know if I can make it, Sergeant," Martinez admitted, though his voice carried determination rather than despair. "Maybe you should leave me here and save yourself." "Nobody gets left behind," Maria replied firmly. "We're all going home together, or we're all staying here together."
She helped Martinez to his feet and began the most harrowing movement of her military career.
Supporting the wounded soldier while simultaneously trying to provide covering fire with her rifle created a tactical nightmare that challenged every skill she had developed over years of combat operations. Enemy fire seemed to intensify as they moved, as if enemy fighters recognized that this was their best opportunity to inflict maximum casualties on the American patrol. Halfway across the open ground, Martinez stumbled and fell, pulling Maria down with him as enemy rounds snapped overhead. For a moment, both soldiers lay motionless in a small depression that provided minimal cover from the surrounding enemy positions. Maria could hear Martinez breathing heavily beside her, and she realized that his wound was worse than she had initially assessed. "Leave me," Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of continuing enemy fire. "Get to safety while you still can." "Not happening," Maria replied as she assessed their tactical situation. They were in a slight depression that provided some concealment from enemy observation, but they were still well within effective range of multiple enemy positions. Moving would expose them to devastating fire, but staying in place would make them sitting targets for enemy mortars that were continuing to impact closer to their position. It was then that Maria heard the most beautiful sound of her military career, the distinctive rotor noise of approaching helicopters. Someone had finally managed to coordinate close air support, and attack helicopters were inbound to engage the enemy positions that had pinned down the patrol. "Thunder 7-1, this is ground unit in contact," she heard Lieutenant Hayes transmitting over his radio from their original position. "We have multiple enemy positions on the ridgeline surrounding our location. Request immediate close air support." The lead helicopter pilot responded with the calm professionalism that characterized Army aviation units operating in combat conditions. "Ground unit, Thunder 7-1, has your position in sight. We observe multiple muzzle flashes from various locations around your position. Stand by for gun runs." Maria felt a surge of hope as she realized that their tactical situation was about to change dramatically. Attack helicopters carried weapon systems that were specifically designed to engage enemy positions in mountainous terrain, and their arrival would shift the balance of the engagement decisively in favor of the American forces. The first rocket attack struck an enemy position approximately 400 yards from Maria's location, sending a column of smoke and debris into the air that was visible from miles away. The explosion was immediately followed by a sustained burst of 30 mmc cannon fire that walked across the ridgeline, where enemy fighters had been engaging the patrol. The effect on enemy morale was immediate and dramatic. The volume of fire directed at American positions decreased significantly, as enemy fighters either fled their positions or were eliminated by the helicopter attacks. For the first time since the engagement had begun, Maria felt that survival was a realistic possibility rather than a desperate hope. "Martinez, can you hear me?" she asked the wounded soldier beside her. "Yeah, I'm still here," Martinez replied, though his voice was noticeably weaker than it had been minutes earlier. "The cavalry's arrived," Maria said, as another helicopter gun run impacted an enemy position to their east. "We're going to get out of this." With enemy fire significantly reduced by the helicopter attacks, Maria was able to help Martinez complete their movement to the alternate position where Johnson was providing medical aid to Rodriguez. The consolidation of the patrol's remaining effective personnel represented a significant improvement in their tactical situation, though both casualties were in need of immediate medical evacuation. Lieutenant Hayes managed to reach their position as the helicopter attacks continued to suppress enemy positions throughout the area. His uniform was torn and dirty, and he had a small cut on his forehead, but he appeared to be uninjured and in control of the tactical situation. "Medical evacuation is inbound," Hayes reported breathlessly. "Dust-off helicopter should be here within 10 minutes to extract our casualties." Maria felt a surge of relief that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. After hours of desperate fighting against overwhelming odds, it appeared that all members of the patrol would survive their encounter with enemy forces. But she also felt a profound sense of frustration about the events that had led to the current crisis. "Sir, if I had still been equipped with my Barrett rifle, this entire engagement could have been avoided," she told Hayes as they watched helicopter gunships continue their attacks on enemy positions. "I could have eliminated the enemy observers before they could report our position, and the ambush would never have been coordinated."
Hayes nodded grimly as he considered her assessment. "I know, Santos."
"I've already included that observation in my initial report to higher headquarters. This whole situation demonstrates the dangers of removing specialized capabilities without considering their tactical importance." The medical evacuation helicopter arrived exactly when promised, landing in a cloud of dust and rotor wash that obscured the surrounding terrain but also provided concealment from any remaining enemy positions. Flight medics immediately began working on Rodriguez and Martinez, stabilizing their wounds for transport to more sophisticated medical facilities. As the casualties were loaded onto the helicopter, Maria felt a complex mixture of emotions that she would struggle to process for years afterward. Relief at their survival was tempered by anger at the bureaucratic decisions that had made the entire crisis necessary. Pride in her soldiers' performance was balanced by frustration at her own inability to provide the kind of precision fire support that had been her specialty. The patrol's extraction was completed without additional casualties, though the helicopter pilots reported observing enemy fighters fleeing the area as American forces consolidated their positions. By nightfall, all members of the patrol were back at Forward Operating Base Chapman, receiving medical attention and participating in the detailed debriefing sessions that followed every combat engagement. The after-action review of the patrol's activities was conducted with unusual intensity by officers from higher headquarters, including several of the same staff personnel who had been present when Maria's rifle had been confiscated. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, who had delivered the original directive about weapons policy changes, seemed particularly interested in the specific details of how the engagement had developed and how different weapons systems might have affected the outcome. Staff Sergeant Santos, in your professional opinion, how might this engagement have proceeded differently if you had been equipped with your original weapon system? Morrison asked during the formal debriefing session. Maria considered her response carefully, knowing that her words would likely influence policy decisions that could affect other soldiers in similar situations. "Sir, with my Barrett rifle system, I would have been able to engage enemy positions at ranges where they could not effectively return fire. The initial observation phase of the engagement would have allowed me to eliminate enemy fighters before they could coordinate an ambush, preventing the entire tactical situation from developing." Morrison made notes in his folder as she spoke, and Maria noticed that several other officers were recording her comments with unusual attention. It was clear that the events of this patrol had attracted significant interest from military leaders who were responsible for making policy decisions about weapons and tactics. How confident are you that you could have prevented enemy forces from coordinating an effective ambush? Morrison asked. Sir, based on 18 months of combat operations with that weapon system, I am confident that I could have eliminated the enemy observation posts that were tracking our movement, Maria replied. Without accurate intelligence about our location and movement, enemy forces would not have been able to coordinate the kind of complex ambush we encountered. The debriefing continued for several hours, covering every aspect of the patrol's activities, from initial planning through final extraction. Maria's comments about the tactical importance of precision fire support were recorded and analyzed by officers who seemed to be developing a new appreciation for the specialized capabilities they had ordered removed from forward-deployed units. 3 days after the patrol, Maria received orders to report to the command post for what she expected to be a routine administrative meeting. Instead, she found herself facing the same group of staff officers who had conducted her debriefing, along with several additional personnel she didn't recognize. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was present, but his demeanor was significantly different from their previous encounters. Staff Sergeant Santos, please be seated, Morrison began, his tone carrying none of the bureaucratic indifference that had characterized their earlier meeting. I want to discuss the policy changes that affected your unit and their impact on tactical operations. Maria sat down with a sense of cautious optimism, hoping that the recent combat engagement had demonstrated the importance of maintaining specialized capabilities even when higher-level policymakers had concerns about their employment. After reviewing the after-action reports from your recent patrol, along with similar reports from other units throughout this theater of operations, we have determined that the temporary withdrawal of Barrett rifle systems was premature. Morrison continued. Effective immediately, all Barrett rifle systems will be returned to their original units, and designated marksmen will resume their specialized roles. Maria felt a surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. The weapon that had defined her military career and saved countless American lives was being returned to her, along with the recognition that specialized capabilities were essential for success in complex tactical environments. Furthermore, Morrison added, your performance during the recent engagement has been recognized at the highest levels of command. You will be recommended for the Bronze Star Medal with V Device for Valor, and your insights about precision fire support have been incorporated into new tactical doctrine for units operating in mountainous terrain. As Maria left the command post with orders to retrieve her rifle from the supply depot, she reflected on the events of the previous week and their broader implications for military operations. The bureaucratic decision to remove specialized weapons had merely cost the lives of 12 American soldiers, demonstrating the dangers of policy changes made without adequate consideration of their tactical consequences. Her Barrett rifle was exactly as she had left it, carefully maintained by supply personnel who understood its importance even when higher authorities had questioned its value. As she conducted her familiar inspection routine, checking each component and verifying the weapon's condition, Maria felt the return of the confidence and capability that had made her an effective soldier. Corporal Thompson was reassigned as her spotter within hours of the policy reversal, and their partnership resumed with the seamless coordination that had characterized their previous combat operations. The specialized equipment and optics that had been packed away were restored to their original configurations, and Maria's role as the unit's designated marksman was officially reinstated. The impact of the policy change extended far beyond Maria's individual situation. Throughout Afghanistan, other sniper teams that had been disbanded were reformed and re-equipped, and the temporary experiment in removing precision fire support capabilities was quietly abandoned. The recognition that specialized skills and equipment were essential for success in complex tactical environments became incorporated into military doctrine and training programs. Rodriguez and Martinez both recovered fully from their wounds and returned to duty within 6 weeks of the engagement. Both soldiers credited Maria's leadership and tactical skills with saving their lives during the ambush, and their accounts of the engagement became part of the unit's unofficial history of combat operations in Afghanistan. Years later, as Maria reflected on her military career and the lessons learned from that particular engagement, she realized that the temporary loss of her rifle had taught her something important about adaptation and leadership under extreme conditions. While specialized equipment and training were certainly valuable, the most important factors in survival and success were the ability to think clearly under pressure and the willingness to take decisive action when lives were at stake. The story of the patrol that nearly ended in disaster became a case study used in military schools and training programs, demonstrating the importance of understanding the tactical implications of policy decisions made at higher levels of command. Maria's experience showed that removing specialized capabilities from combat units could have consequences that extended far beyond simple changes in equipment inventory. But perhaps most importantly, the entire experience reinforced the fundamental truth that had guided Maria throughout her military career, that the safety and welfare of soldiers must always take precedence over administrative convenience or bureaucratic expediency. In the unforgiving environment of combat operations, there is no substitute for providing soldiers with the tools and training they need to accomplish their missions and return home safely. The Barrett rifle that had been temporarily taken away was never again separated from Maria during her remaining deployment in Afghanistan. She continued serving as her unit's designated marksman until the completion of her deployment, using her specialized skills to provide overwatch and precision fire support that undoubtedly saved additional American lives. When Maria finally returned to the United States, she carried with her not only the memories of successful combat operations, but also a deeper understanding of the complex relationships between policy, tactics, and soldier welfare that characterize modern military operations. Her experience had shown that even well-intentioned policy changes could have unintended consequences that threatened the very people they were supposed to protect. The Bronze Star Medal she received for her actions during the ambush was meaningful not just as recognition of her individual courage, but as acknowledgement that specialized skills and equipment remained essential components of effective military operations. Her story became part of the institutional memory that would influence future decisions about weapons policy and tactical doctrine. In the end, the temporary removal of Maria's sniper rifle had demonstrated something that military leaders had known intuitively but perhaps needed to be reminded of through hard experience: that in combat, there is no substitute for having the right tool for the job. Operated by skilled personnel who understand how to employ it effectively, the bureaucratic decision that had nearly doomed an entire squad ultimately served to reinforce the importance of maintaining specialized capabilities that could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers operating in harm's way.